On a cramped, crooked hill sat a house with far too many stairs and too few functioning doors. To any casual observer, it looked like the kind of place to scare unsuspecting visitors on dark, moonless nights. The chimney leaned precariously, the windows squeaked in the breeze, and the iron gate out front had a habit of swinging open on its own. Most people in the nearby town believed the house was haunted, but few knew just how peculiar its otherworldly resident actually was. You see, the ghost who lived in that house was the single most inefficient haunter anyone had ever encountered. It wasn't that he lacked confidence. He simply lacked the ability to glide through walls without becoming a bizarre, floating half ghost on the wrong side of the plaster. He had been stuck there, just beyond the veil of existence, for what felt like a century or two. Of course, the afterlife's sense of time was fuzzy, so it might have only been 50 years. Regardless, his routine rarely changed. Attempt to haunt, attempt to glide, get stuck, wriggle free, and hide in shame while other ghosts soared gracefully through locked doors and solid walls. Tipping his top hat, he had once been quite the dapper gent before his final day on Earth, he would lament the fact that transparency had forsaken him. He wished he could just go through walls like everyone said ghosts could do. Well, everyone except him, apparently. One morning, or whatever passed for morning in that creaky old house, he drifted out of the broom closet where he had taken to residing. Because he persisted in half getting stuck, he had somewhat lost his sense of geography. It was safer to stay somewhere that had a door he could open the normal way if he felt trapped. He floated over the dusty floorboards, rising a few inches off the ground as he tried to exude eerie. It was going well until he took a sharp left turn and smacked straight into the rotting banister. To his horror, he found his torso had slipped through the railings, but his ghostly bottom half remained on the other side. The banister sank halfway into his glowing midriff, making him appear like a guilty child trying to sneak through the bars. With a horrified sputter, he attempted to salvage the situation. Relax, he told himself. Just float backward, gently, slowly. He pulled at his shoulders, flailed his arms in the air, and tried to slide free. But that only wedged him further, and he became stuck up to his ghostly belt line. At last, he realized he was being entirely too thirsty for success. He closed his eyes, mustered a drop of spectral confidence, and let out a wavering moan. After a tiny pop, he slipped backward, stumbled through the scuffed floor, and landed in a sheepish heap at the foot of the stairs. His dusty top hat flew off his head, bouncing off the banister rails with a clatter that made him cringe. That was strike one for the day. He tried to regain what was left of his dignity and attempted a more standard haunting ritual, rattling a set of chains from the corner of the foyer. Even this seemed beyond him. The chain clanked like a squeaky door hinge rather than the dramatic, bone-chilling sound he imagined. The floor groaned in pity. A spider crawled across the ghost's foot. He was certain the spider didn't even realize it had trodden on a phantom. "Nothing is going my way lately," he muttered, "but I cannot give up. Tonight, I shall spook someone properly, and I shall pass through a wall fully with all limbs and top hat intact." He spent the late afternoon floating about, trying to build up his courage. He practiced drifting through blankets, chairs, and bits of furniture, hoping he could train his senses to allow for easier passage through larger objects. He managed to get a table's corner stuck between his ribs, which he managed to wriggle free of after an embarrassingly long period of silent panic. The next attempt featured an arm stuck in a coat rack, then a leg trapped in the kitchen door. Each time, he nearly hyperventilated, though ghosts didn't actually breathe. It was hard to recall that detail when he felt so anxious, imagining the infinite humiliation of having his left ankle remain in the afterlife while the rest of him drifted into the living room. Eventually, the sun ducked beneath the horizon, and the house grew dim. The usual night sounds emerged, groaning pipes, squeaking shutters, and the faint whisper of wind that had a way of licking around corners with unsettling notes. To the humans in the nearby town, this was prime haunting hour. Indeed, a group of high school students had worked up the nerve to stay overnight in the spooky old house on a dare. They trooped in despite the warnings from neighbors, armed with flashlights and an insatiable thirst for ghost stories. The ghost caught wind of their arrival when the gate out front squealed open with an extra loud shriek, the perfect invitation. "Ah, visitors," he said, swirling around in the hallway with renewed vigor. "This is it, my big chance to show I can be a frightening presence." He stroked his left mustache edge, an echo of his old habit when he was alive. "And with any luck, I'll pass straight through the wall to greet them in the grand foyer." He inhaled deeply, purely out of habit. Yes, to the foyer, half ghost no more. He turned to face the wall leading to the foyer, shut his eyes, and pushed forward. At first, things went better than expected. He felt the air shift around him and he caught a fleeting sense of success, but that was followed by a soft thunk and an abrupt stop. Opening his eyes, he saw he was still in the hallway, except his left shoulder and half his face somehow ended up grounding in the foyer. He had effectively pinned himself in the center of the wall, as if pinned there by a decorator with the worst sense of taste imaginable. With a groan, he tried to yank himself free, but the sight of his floating face on one side and his ghostly backside on the other was not the vision of horror he hoped to inspire. The students walked into the foyer mere seconds later, swinging their flashlights around to reveal cobwebs, cracked tiles, and a dusty chandelier. One spotted the bizarre vision of a half-loping face peeking out of the wall. However, rather than being frightened out of their wits, they stared in confusion. One boy aimed his flashlight at the ghost and blinked several times. The ghost's face felt hot with embarrassment, though technically no heat existed within his spectral form. "Oh my gosh, is that a ghost?" one girl whispered, stepping forward. "He's sort of stuck?" The group inched closer, uncertain whether to feel afraid or just plain sorry for what looked like a bungled haunting job. The ghost attempted to recover, letting out his best moan, something like, "Ooh, ooh, ooh," though it wasn't as otherworldly as he hoped. In fact, a repeated hitch got caught in his ephemeral throat, making him sound more like an owl with a sinus problem. Mortified, he tried once again to wiggle himself free, but the wall had it out for him. The students, though nervous, decided to watch quietly, perhaps trying to figure out if they should help. Finally, a hearty tug from the ghost's side flung him forward in a burst of spectral energy. He tumbled into the foyer and crashed directly into the dusty chandelier, causing it to sway precariously overhead while bits of plaster fluttered down like confetti. The student squealed, half in panic, half in comedic shock. A lopsided grin crossed the ghost's face as he tried desperately to float upright, swirling dust motes around him in messy clouds. "Welcome to my domain," he announced, deepening his voice for dramatic flair. "I am the unstoppable spirit well," he felt his speech unravel under the astonished stares of 6 sets of teenage eyes. In moments like these, he almost wished he could vanish entirely. Despite his embarrassment, the students actually seemed intrigued. Rather than turning tail and running, they whispered among themselves, occasionally pointing at him. "We should record this," one suggested, pulling out a phone. Another whipped out a digital camera, determined to snap a photo of the half-rate ghost. Mortified, he tried to salvage his pride by hovering menacingly above them, swirling his arms in a menacing circle. But he ended up tangling his sleeve in the chandelier chain. That forced him to spin in place like a wobbly top, arms flailing, moans devolving into frantic yelps. The students were no longer sure what they were witnessing. Horror's classic sense of dread was replaced with something more akin to comedic curiosity. One boy carefully reached up and detached the ghost's sleeve from the chain, allowing him to spin free and wobble back to the floor. The ghost stood there, further deflated if that was even possible. "I'm so sorry," he managed to say in a voice like a squeaky door. "This isn't going at all how I planned." He smoothed his top hat in vain. "Allow me to show you something. Anything. Let's do a classic door slam. Everyone loves that." He zoomed off toward the nearest door, determined to prove he could do at least one spooky task. The door in question was half-rotted wood with peeling green paint. He angled himself behind it, mustered energy, and let out a fearsome boo. Then, with all his might, he attempted to slam it from behind, expecting a thunderous wham to echo through the hall. Instead, his ghostly hand passed straight through the doorknob. Not in an elegant, ghostly manner, he couldn't gain the friction needed to shut it. It was like trying to pick up a shadow. He tried once more, making wild gestures, but all he managed was a gentle bump. The feeble tap only served to swirl a bit of dust in the air. Then the door squeaked back open, revealing the ghost's humiliated form behind it. One of the teenagers coughed softly, trying to stifle a laugh. The ghost decided to step aside from the direct approach. Perhaps an eerie voice in the corridor, or a disembodied whisper, he murmured. Summoning the bravest portion of his spectral nature, he glided into the hallway. He peered around the corner to ensure the group was waiting with bated breath. Then, in his creepiest tone, he let out a long, wheezing moan. The echo drifted down the corridor, bouncing off the peeling wallpaper. He was momentarily proud of this effect. It sounded sufficiently ghostly. But while still mid-moaning, he turned around and smacked directly into the hallway's enormous grandfather clock. The collision rang out in a deep, booming chime that overshadowed his moan entirely, turning it into a startled gah that reverberated in comedic disharmony. The clock face spun wildly as he clung to the wooden edges, trying not to topple it. In a spectacular chain of events, he jolted the clock so hard it began to teeter. He tried righting it, only to find his hands faced halfway into the wood, making it nearly impossible to stabilize. With a dreadful groan, the clock keeled forward and the ghost dove to catch it. Instead, he ended up pinned under the massive timepiece, his intangible form half stuck, half free, ghostly legs wiggling in the air. He let out a frustrated holler while the group of teenagers rushed in to help, uncertain how exactly one rescues a transparent entity trapped beneath a hunk of wood. The entire fiasco might have been comedic gold for them, but for the ghost, it was a humiliating nightmare. He spent the rest of the evening trying various haunting tactics, each ending more embarrassingly than the last. He attempted to float through a mirror to appear behind them in a jump scare, but he got caught in the glass, turning the reflective surface into a bizarre image of his face pressed against the silver backing. He tried to blow out their candles from afar, but ended up inhaling dust and coughing so fiercely that all he managed was a half-breeze that made the candles flicker rather than extinguish. He tried forming ghostly shapes in the shadows, but in the middle of the act, he stumbled over a loose floorboard and nearly toppled through the floor. Eventually, the teenagers were gently coaxing him to calm down, claiming he should rest. "It's okay," they said. "You're trying your best." The ghost felt a mixture of gratitude and defeat. "I'm supposed to be frightening you," he said mournfully, "not the other way around." "You're not scaring us," one of them admitted. "But that's okay. You're kind of fun in a weird sort of way." He drifted to the far side of the foyer to think about that. It had never occurred to him that ghosts might bring joy instead of terror. He always assumed a ghost's job was to spook the living and send them shrieking into the night. Perhaps there was room in the world for a friendly ghost, albeit one who got irrevocably stuck in walls. Still, being stuck halfway through a wall was inconvenient. He needed to solve that problem. He didn't want a future of splitting himself in half in front of every visitor. Somehow he had to learn how to be intangible, truly intangible, in all the ways a ghost was supposed to be. Later that night, while the teenagers dozed off in their sleeping bags, they were confident the ghost wasn't going to do them any harm. He reflected on his predicament. Why was it so difficult for him to pass through solid objects? Was it something to do with his mindset? Could it be that he clung too tightly to his physical self? He remembered an older ghost once telling him that the key to gliding was letting go of earthly attachments. Perhaps he'd never truly let go. Maybe some longing bound him. With that in mind, he floated outside, drifting through the open window. He managed not to get stuck, so that was progress, and perched on the sagging porch swing. From there he gazed at the moon, remembering what he missed about the living world. He thought of the hat on his head, one of the few possessions he insisted on keeping. He remembered the day he bought it in a fancy shop imagining he'd cut a fine figure at the local dance. He recalled the swirl of pastel lights, the laughter, the smell of peach tea. Oh, how he loved that memory. Perhaps that was the reason he could not let go of the living world. But did he even have to? Could he find a balance, a way to keep the nostalgia of that day without letting it anchor him so firmly that he got stuck in walls? By early morning, he resolved to try once again. He meandered back inside, passing the teenagers who were yawning and packing up their things. They told him they'd planned to leave soon, as they had to return to their normal lives. The ghost nodded solemnly, tipping his hat. He thanked them for their company in a voice that sounded more steady than before. As they filed out, he promised them that if they ever returned, he would be the spookiest ghost they'd ever seen. Their faces lit with gentle fondness, something akin to pity, but also a genuine fondness for the well-intentioned but bumbling specter. The gate clanged shut behind them. He tried to wave goodbye and predictably ended up with his arm lodged halfway through the front door. He had to yank it free with a groan, but he tried not to let it deter him. He was determined to practice until he got it right. For weeks he practiced in solitude, rummaging through every part of the house. He'd start small, drifting his hand through a cup or a plate. At times, his elbow would catch in the porcelain, shattering it. But gradually, he learned to think less about the physical object and more about his intangible nature. He practiced stepping backward through walls instead of forward, trying any method that might break his mental barriers. He avoided objects during the day, reciting mantras like, "You are air, you are mist, you are untethered." He might have felt a bit silly, but there was no one watching, so it hardly mattered. Hours turned to days, and days turned to weeks, until finally, one quiet night, he felt it might be time for a bigger test. There was a large, thick, wooden door in the back of the house that had always intimidated him. A sturdy iron key was lodged in its lock, refusing to budge. If ever there was a challenge, he said to himself, this would be it. He rubbed his translucent palms together, summoned the best of his newfound calm, and approached it slowly. He stood inches away from the door, took a moment to let his ghostly form soften, and leaned in. At first he sensed the familiar resistance, as though the door were telling him, no entry. He felt fear bubble up, recalling all the times he'd been pinned, stuck, or contorted. But he took a spiritual breath, remembering that sense of letting go. He channeled the memory of the dance hall and the pastel lights, but rather than clinging to them, he let them drift away like old postcards. Gently, hesitantly, he pressed one foot forward, then his torso, then his entire body, and passed right through. Blinking in amazement, he found himself on the other side of the door, entirely intact, top hat and all. His mouth fell open in a silent gasp. I did it! He breathed, spinning in place with delight. He soared around the back room in a loop of ghostly glee, brushing through walls with no more difficulty than a breeze. Yes, ha-ha, he whooped, passing back and forth through the thick door for good measure, as if to reassure himself that this victory wasn't a fluke. He did get momentarily stuck around the door handle once, but it only took a minor effort to free himself. That alone was a triumph compared to the fiascos of the past. From that moment on, the ghost discovered he could truly utilize his intangible nature. Though not perfect, he still had slip-ups. If he lost focus, he could at last perform basic haunting tasks. He manifested in the foyer with an imposing swirl, flew up to the chandelier, rattled it just enough for dramatic effect, and soared away without tangling himself in the chain. He breezed through windows, letting out ghostly moans that echoed through corridors with eerie charm. The house, once filled with humiliations, finally embraced him with the recognition of a true, spectral inhabitant. Word of the haunted house spread through town. In time, curious souls would creep up to its iron gate, daring each other to go inside after dusk. When they did, they discovered a ghost with a flair for drama. He would swoop out of the darkness, moaning in perfect dissonance with the wind, rattling old chains that hung from the rafters, and stepping through walls as though they were made of fog. He even developed the ability to flicker the lights, an art form that took practice. Occasionally, his old clumsy habits reappeared, and he might trip over a floorboard or get his sleeve stuck. But he always managed to recover with surprising poise. In fact, those little moments only enhanced the comedic tension he brought to his hauntings, transforming him into a local legend of endearingly spooky fun. Sometimes the teenagers who had first encountered him returned. They would set up cameras half hoping to catch his comedic blunders, but instead, they found a more confident specter. He would greet them with a tip of his hat, vanish through a wall without so much as a flicker of hesitation, then pop out behind them with a playful boo that sometimes even caused a few startled shrieks. He'd cackle in delight, swirling his arms overhead, and they'd laugh just as often as they jumped. On special nights, he would reenact the dancing environment he remembered so fondly. He'd hum a tune from yesteryear, floating across the foyer as if dancing with a ghostly partner. The kids would watch, mesmerized as he glided in graceful circles. Despite the spooky ambiance, there was an undercurrent of lighthearted joy in everything he did. Over time, he came to see that being a ghost was more than terrorizing the living. Through the mishaps and embarrassments, he forged connections, a sense of audience engagement. The house wasn't just a trap for unsuspecting souls. It became a place where people could experience a bit of harmless fright, a few laughs, and a glimpse into a world beyond their own. His comedic missteps became part of his legend, something that set him apart from other apparitions rumored to haunt the countryside. Those tales were all seriousness and gloom, while he offered a story of growth, change, and earnest effort. What he once considered a crippling flaw, the inability to pass through walls, turned out to be the spark that ignited his own brand of haunting. Without those humiliating moments, he wouldn't have discovered his capacity for humor. He wouldn't have realized how laughter and ghosts could mix, giving him a unique identity in a realm where apparitions too often fixated on spooky moans and rattling chains. Now, he could do it all, mixing comedic timing with spectral illusions and the occasional well-timed dash through a boarded-up doorway. It brought him purpose he'd never before known. Late one night, he found himself once again on the porch swing, drifting gently back and forth. He'd just finished another performance for a group of adventurous visitors, leaving them half spooked, half delighted, and wholly enamored by his strange charm. He looked at the moon and felt the soft hush of the night around him. He recalled how he once thought being a ghost meant leaving all joy behind, but now he knew different. Joy could follow him into the afterlife if he allowed it. Realizing that gave him a sense of peace, and that peace had unlocked his true ghostly nature. He rose from the swing and scarcely noticed how effortlessly he phased through the porch column as he floated back into the house. Passing through it felt as simple as walking through a curtain. He didn't even stumble. "How far I've come," he murmured with a grin. He popped his head through the wall to look at the living room, then casually slipped the rest of himself through. It was so smooth he almost didn't believe it. He let out a small chuckle, remembering the days of humiliating half-wall fiascos. Perhaps there were still comedic accidents in his future, likely so if he had anything to say about it. But for tonight at least, he moved with a spectral grace all his own. He concluded his evening by drifting up the staircase, which creaked mournfully with each step as though bemoaning an ancient ache. The floors recognized their longtime resident, the banister no longer seeking to trap him. He found himself in the dusty corridor that led to his broom closet sanctuary. It still provided a sense of familiarity even though he no longer needed it as a safe retreat. This time, however, he continued floating until he reached the far wall. He took a moment to steady himself, then glided straight through into the bedroom on the other side. No hiccup, no half lodge. He marveled at how wonderful it felt to be free from that stumbling block. Later, he settled himself on a rickety chair, simply existing in the hush of the moonlit room. One or two ghosts from the neighboring old houses even popped in for a friendly chat, hearing he'd finally mastered the intangible arts. They congratulated him, each telling stories of how they, too, had struggled in their own ways when they first crossed over learning how to vanish, how to moan effectively, how to scare the living while maintaining a bit of ghostly dignity. He swapped tales with them long into the night. They laughed about the fiasco with the chandelier, the door slams gone wrong, and the clock that pinned him to the floor. It all seemed so distant now, like comedic myths that barely felt real. Before dawn, he escorted his fellow ghosts to the foyer, walking them through the house with a flourish of theatrics, showing off how easily he stepped through walls. They teased him good-naturedly, reminding him not to get too cocky, or else he might find himself stuck all over again. He chuckled, fully aware that comedic mishaps still seemed to follow him wherever he went, but at least now they weren't a source of shame. They were part of his charm. When the other ghosts departed, drifting off into the early morning mist, he found himself eager for the next set of visitors. Perhaps in the coming nights, new groups of curious souls would venture inside. He'd be ready, prepared to give them both a smile and a scare. Alone in the quiet old house, the ghost reflected on the journey that transformed him. He once identified himself as the bungling spirit who couldn't glide, destined to be stuck in walls forever, but now he glided across thresholds with ease, no longer shackled by his own self-doubt. If anything, those humiliations had tempered him into a more spirited Spectre One, capable of fearsome sounds and comedic charm. He thought about how the living often believed ghosts to be remnants of sorrow or tragedy. Yet here he was, discovering happiness, forging funny memories, and learning that even the afterlife had room for second chances. Night after night, he continued to blend silly antics with genuine ghostly wonder, forging a new legend for the old crooked house on the hill. And while passers-by might shudder at the eerie silhouette in the attic window or the flickering lights beneath the eaves, those who dared cross the threshold would leave with ghost stories that contained equal measures of giggles and gasps. They'd speak about the ghost who once couldn't move through walls without getting stuck, yet who found a way to laugh and persevere until he finally, gloriously, got it right. And so, the house remained a place of shadows and laughter, the perfect blend of chills and chuckles. The reluctant ghost once pinned in doorways gained a reputation for kindness and clumsiness in equal measure, a spirit who took the age-old craft of haunting and gave it a whimsical spin. On certain nights, one could hear his melodramatic wails drifting through corridors. Sometimes they caused hearts to race and adrenaline to spike. Other times, they ended in muffled laughter and a gentle glow that felt downright comforting. That was the delight of visiting his domain. Nobody ever quite knew which half of his ghostly nature they'd encounter, but they always left with a story worth telling, a story that proved even a spectral misfit could become a legend in his own hilarious way.